I was just pulling my sweater over my head when I heard the door creak open behind me. The rush of cool air against my bare skin made my stomach clench. I turned sharply, expecting my husband. Maybe he had forgotten something and come back early. But it wasn't him. It was Ethan, my stepson. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His expression flickered, shock, embarrassment, something else I couldn't quite place. I yanked the sweater down over myself, my face burning. Ethan, my voice cracked, the weight of the situation hitting me all at once. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. A moment too late, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. My pulse thundered in my ears. This was an accident, wasn't it? But something in his eyes told me otherwise. My name is Claire, and for the past 5 years, I've been married to Mark. He's strong, dependable, and the kind of man who doesn't believe in gray areas. Everything in life is either right or wrong, black or white. I admired that about him once. Now, I'm not so sure. Mark came into our marriage with a son from his first wife, Ethan. A quiet, brooding 19-year-old who had grown from an awkward teenager into a man seemingly overnight. When I first met him, he barely looked at me. He treated me with the polite distance of a stranger who had no choice but to share a roof with me. I told myself it was understandable. After all, I wasn't his mother. We lived in a house that always felt too big, too pristine. Mark liked things a certain way, clean, orderly, predictable. The kind of man who made schedules for everything. Gym at 5, work at 7, dinner at 6 sharp. It wasn't a bad life, just a structured one. I had my routines, too. Early mornings with coffee on the back patio, late nights curled up with a book. It was a comfortable existence, if a bit lonely. Ethan, on the other hand, was an enigma. He had his father's sharp jaw and dark eyes, but none of his rigidity. He moved through life differently, fluid, unpredictable. He had a way of making silence feel heavier than words. He rarely spoke at dinner, answering Mark's questions in clipped sentences while stirring his food around his plate. I noticed everything about him. The way his fingers drummed against the counter absent-mindedly, the way his gaze lingered on things as if he were trying to memorize them. And then there was the moment in my bedroom. The accident. Or was it? The look in his eyes still haunted me. Not just shock or embarrassment. There was something deeper, something that made my breath catch in my throat. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was nothing. But I felt it. A shift. A ripple in the stillness of our carefully constructed lives. And I had no idea where it would lead. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was an innocent mistake. But the weight of Ethan's gaze lingered like the ghost of a touch, unsettling and impossible to ignore. At dinner that night, I felt it again, an awareness, an unspoken tension stretching between us. Mark sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone between bites of steak, oblivious. Ethan sat across from me, his fork pushing peas around his plate, barely eating. I kept my eyes on my food, but I could feel him watching me. "You're quiet tonight," Mark said, glancing at me. I forced a smile. "Just tired." Ethan's fork scraped against the plate, a sharp, grating sound that made me flinch. "Ethan," Mark said, not even looking up, "don't play with your food." Ethan didn't respond. He just stood abruptly, grabbing his plate. "I'm not hungry." He turned toward the kitchen. "Ethan," I said without thinking. He paused but didn't turn around. My pulse hammered. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. I just wanted to break the tension, to make this, whatever this was, go away. But he didn't wait. A second later, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving his half-eaten dinner behind. Mark sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know what's gotten into him lately." I swallowed. I did. Over the next few days, Ethan avoided me. Or maybe I avoided him. I wasn't sure. Either way, we moved like strangers in the same house, careful not to cross paths. But then came the moment that changed everything. It was late, past midnight. Mark was asleep beside me, his deep, even breaths filling the silence. I was restless, my mind looping over that look in Ethan's eyes. I climbed out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and padded down the hallway to the kitchen for a glass of water. And then I saw him, Ethan, leaning against the counter, a half-empty glass in his hand. His dark eyes flicked up to mine as I stepped into the room, and for a second, neither of us spoke. I swallowed hard. Couldn't sleep? He let out a quiet breath. No. I hesitated, fingers tightening around my glass. Listen, about what happened the other day. He shook his head, cutting me off. You don't have to say anything. I exhaled, relief and something else, a deeper, more dangerous emotion, flooding through me. It was just an accident, I said softly. Ethan held my gaze for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, Was it? A sharp current passed between us, invisible but undeniable. My breath caught in my throat. I should have shut it down right then. I should have laughed, told him not to be ridiculous. I should have done 100 things. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my pulse hammering, and realized with terrifying certainty. I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I returned to bed, my body was too tense, my mind too loud. Ethan's words played on a loop. Was it? It was supposed to be an accident. That's what I told myself. That's what it should have been. But something inside me twisted at the thought, something I wasn't ready to name. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I brewed coffee, set out Mark's breakfast, went through the motions of the life I'd built. But everything felt different. Like the walls of this house, the routines I'd clung to, had been peeled back to reveal something raw underneath. Ethan came into the kitchen as I was pouring my coffee. I didn't turn around, but I felt him there. The air between us was electric, charged with something unsaid. Mark walked in a moment later, oblivious, dropping a kiss on my cheek before grabbing his thermos. I have a meeting late tonight, he said. Don't wait up for me. I nodded, but my heart pounded. I didn't want to be alone in this house with Ethan. Not now. Not when everything felt so precarious. When Mark left, the silence that followed was unbearable. I turned, finally meeting Ethan's gaze. His expression was unreadable. We need to talk, he said. I swallowed, gripping my coffee cup tighter. Ethan. Don't. His voice was quiet but firm. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. You felt it too? I shook my head, but it wasn't convincing. You're imagining things. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. No, I'm not. And neither are you. Panic flared in my chest. Ethan, this is wrong. He let out a bitter laugh. I know. We stood there, the truth hanging between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to deny it, to push it away, but it was already too late. It wasn't about the moment in my bedroom anymore. That was just the crack in the foundation. The truth was, I had been lonely for a long time. I had married a man who gave me security, but not passion. A man who loved me in a quiet, practical way, but never saw me. And Ethan saw everything. That was the real betrayal, wasn't it? Not the moment in my bedroom, not this conversation, but the way I had already crossed a line, long before now, in the quiet spaces of my own mind. I sucked in a shaky breath. This can't happen. Ethan's jaw tightened. I know. A long silence stretched between us. And then, finally, he stepped back. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to, because we both understood. The days that followed were filled with a silence heavier than words. Ethan and I moved carefully through the house, like strangers bound by an unspoken secret. I avoided his gaze. He avoided being alone with me. And yet, the weight of what had passed between us lingered in every glance, every breath. Mark never noticed. He kissed my forehead in the mornings, asked about my day in the evenings, and never once suspected that his wife and his son were carrying something they could never say out loud. One evening, as I stood by the kitchen sink washing dishes, Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I'm leaving," he said. I turned, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What?" "I've been thinking about it for a while." He looked away, then back at me. "I need to get out of here. Figure things out for myself." I nodded slowly, my throat tight. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet." His lips pressed into a thin line. "But I can't stay." I wanted to tell him he didn't have to leave, that we could find a way to undo this, to go back to whatever we were before. But I knew better. There was no going back. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said quietly. Ethan's gaze lingered on mine for a moment, one final, silent exchange of everything we couldn't say. Then he nodded and walked away. That night, I lay in bed next to Mark, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing. I wondered if he knew, if on some subconscious level, he had always known how distant I felt, how much of myself I had lost in this marriage. I turned onto my side, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Ethan leaving didn't change the truth. The betrayal had never been in an action. It had been in the feelings I allowed myself to have. And some betrayals never leave you. The damage was already done.